The argument about California being admitted as a free state rather than a slave state hinged on political power, as votes in Congress fell strictly along party lines, with the Republican Whig Party voting against slavery and the Democrats voting for slavery. The Whigs had started out as the conservative Democrats and were opposed to the Democratic Republicans, and the Whigs had been Federalists while the Democratic Republicans were just Democrats. And President Polk was a states' rights fiscal conservative who wanted to keep the government's money in an independent treasury rather than in private banks. President Polk had been an admirer of Andrew Jackson, with the populist idea that a strong executive was needed to keep the elites in Congress from indulging in their predictable corruption. And this was accomplished by a forceful use of the veto pen, so Polk's stance on an equal balance of free and slave states was to prevent either side in Congress from gaining a majority, and the stalemate within Congress would therefore result in the executive being able to call the shots. The Whigs would become the anti-slavery Republican Party in 1856, with their nomination of Fremont as their first candidate for president in the 1856 election, which Fremont would have won except for the Know-Nothings coming in as a third party to take 20% of the vote away from the new Republican Party. Instead of Fremont becoming president, the pro-slavery Democrat candidate won, and the Know-Nothings would join with the Republicans in the next election to put Abraham Lincoln into office in 1860. The question of California was directly center on President Polk's table in 1847, and the slavery issue was deciding every single vote taken in Congress, no matter what they were voting about. And with Texas allowed in as a slave state, California needed to remain free to keep the pro-slavery Democrats in Congress in check. Every American president before and including Polk had owned slaves except for John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams, and it was not sensitivity to the nature of slavery that drove the Whigs and the Know-Nothings, because owning slaves had been the natural course in the ways of the world, and slavery was even written into the Bible as not being objectionable. The argument around slavery did not concern any unfairness about involuntary servitude, because having a place in the world and food on the table was considered a blessing. And the argument was not even about the economic differences between those who kept slaves and those who did not. But opposition to slavery was that the anti-slavery people just didn't like Africans, who were seen as too foreign to be considered Americans. And that was partially solved when the importation of the savages from Africa was made illegal in 1820, with only the offspring of the more Americanized slaves allowed to remain on United States soil. Dark-skinned people from the African jungles had fit nicely within the system of slavery because the good God-fearing Christian Southerners saw them as having been cursed with the mark of Ham in the Bible, and giving them a place and a purpose was doing them a big favor. And dark skin color made it easy to differentiate those who were bound from those who were free. The English had branded their slaves on the forehead with red-hot irons, and the Romans had pierced the ears of their slaves to tell them apart from free men. And if the North were allowing dark-skinned people to wander around without chains, how was the institution of slavery to survive? Commodore Stockton was so anti-slavery that he had been instrumental in the founding of Liberia, while the crusade against slave-owning did not for a moment consider the idea of freeing slaves for them to roam around without a place in American society, but that they should be deported back to Africa. The problem was not just the logistics of how expensive and difficult that undertaking would be, but the stark reality that it had been generations since most of them had lived on the African continent, so a new country had to be carved out to accommodate them, and that would be in Liberia. To keep General Kearny away from California politics after Fremont's trial, President Polk ordered Kearny to Mexico to assume the office of the military governor of Veracruz, and from there he was to be stationed in Mexico City, but he got yellow fever in Veracruz and couldn't shake it. And Kearny returned to St. Louis, where he died in October of 1848 at the age of 54. The Rio Grande River became the final border with Mexico, and by 1853 the boundaries of America were complete, with only Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico coming in later. Fremont had bought a ranch on the 10th of February in 1847 from the former Mexican governor Juan Bautista Alvarado, 1 month after signing the Treaty of Cahuenga, and Fremont hired some managers and some general contractors and some Mexican workers, and so he'd been free to return to Washington, D.C. 90 days later to face the charges against him. The accusations against Fremont had some teeth because Fremont's instructions from Polk had been not to fight Mexicans, which would have been a violation of the neutrality laws, but to get prepared to fight the British, which is why the Navy had been sent to the shores of Northern California, and why Fremont had been under orders issued under the jurisdiction of the Navy, and not acting in contradiction to his orders from the Army Topographical Corps of Engineers that was a branch of the Army. Upper Klamath Lake was 100 miles north of where the Sacramento River ceased being navigable, and it was on the 15th of June in 1846, while Fremont and his men were billeted at Klamath Lake, that Britain signed the Treaty of Oregon, leaving America to itself below the border of the 49th latitude, something they'd refused until Congress voted to declare war on Mexico on the 13th of May in 1846. Benton enjoyed access to dispatches from U.S. diplomats in Mexico, many of which were translated into English by Jessie in the family's parlor, an arrangement that gave Fremont access to many confidential messages. He knew, for instance, that much of the speculation about possible war with Mexico centered on possible British reaction to such a conflict. Speculation was rife that, in the event of war, Britain would come to Mexico's side and, in the event of victory, take California, or, more likely, Oregon for its prize. Pathfinder John Charles Fremont and the Course of American Empire by Tom Chaffin, New York. Hill and Wang, a division of Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, 2002, page 250. While the British trade in cotton with the southern states was no secret, the Mexicans had not been seen as a barrier to Polk's offer to buy California from Mexico, and the purchase was to be financed by southern slaveholders. With the purchase of California, a fight had been expected with the British in Oregon as a necessary consequence, since Oregon Territory would be allowed to apply for statehood as a free state to keep up the balance between slave and free, and that needed to happen at the same time that California was admitted as a slave state to keep the balance of power in Congress. Fremont's orders had not been to take California, but to prepare to win Oregon away from the British. And Britain had been willing to leave the Pacific Northwest alone because they were still squandering their resources, looking for the Northwest Passage above Canada so they could sail to China. The good showing in battle of the American military in winning Texas away from Mexico had gone a long way towards bringing the British to terms in the Treaty of Oregon in June of 1846, so there had been more to Fremont's courts-martial than just an Army-Navy fight, since General Kearny had been dead set against a two-front war against both Mexico and Britain, but Kearny had underestimated President Polk's negotiating skills and Fremont's resourcefulness in getting the British to accept American sovereignty in the Pacific Northwest. When the Bear Flaggers had waylaid Fremont before war was declared, they'd spread word of his extreme competence that had mushroomed and blossomed into daring tales of fighting Mexicans that grew to legendary proportions, and this word-of-mouth rumor, based on great exaggeration, went all up and down the coast, while Fremont returned to his base at the upper Klamath Lake that was 300 miles north of San Francisco and only 100 miles south of the British fort on the Columbia River in Oregon, just a few days' march away from their Hudson's Bay post. The verdict against Fremont was handed down on the 31st of January in 1848, and Southerners had called for Fremont's impeachment on the grounds that he had abused his office, while Northerners applauded him for using his office, and one judge opposed Fremont simply because the judge was a pro-slave Southerner. Senator Benton gave a speech before the Senate opposing a promotion for Kearny that lasted for 13 days. And Senator Benton was the chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs, and he was a decorated colonel during the time when there were many colonels from the South who had never even been in the military. Senator Benton resigned after Fremont's trial, but not before heralding the publication of the official report of Fremont's thrilling third expedition to California, of which 20,000 copies were printed for sale, written down in glowing detail by Fremont's faithful wife, Senator Benton's daughter Jessie. Fremont's courts-martial had been very unmilitary and went on for 5 months, with Southern senators trying to silence both Fremont and Senator Benton. And Fremont's trial was a total embarrassment for all sides, exposing the conquest of California as nothing but a free-for-all. Fremont argued that Kearny's obvious subservience to Stockton had been another element in Fremont's following suit, while Kearny claimed that because Fremont was an army man, the naval Stockton had no authority over Fremont. The jury found Fremont guilty, but recommended his sentencing to President Polk, who found Fremont not guilty of mutiny, but guilty of the lesser charge of insubordination, which may have come somewhat from personal revenge against his old romantic rival, but more likely Polk had thrown the pro-slavery people a bone due to Fremont's cavalier attitude towards slavery and the objectionable fact that Fremont always traveled with his black friend who was a free Negro. Major Fremont had borrowed $3,000 from his father-in-law Benton and Benton's friend John Adams Dix to buy a ranch in California at the beginning of 1847, and Dix would be the Secretary of the Treasury when the war between the states broke out. And Dix would begin a POW exchange program with the South that would fail when the South began refusing to return Northern soldiers of African origin, claiming they needed to be returned to their former owners. But it would soon be discovered that many of the captured Union soldiers of African descent had never been owned by anyone, and with this revelation, the principles of the South would begin to crack, spreading doubt throughout the Confederacy. President Polk would return home to Tennessee on the 3rd of March in 1849 when his term expired, and he would die 3 months later, and California would vote on the 20th of December that year for their 2 senators who would go to Washington, D.C. And as it happened, California would remain the 31st state until Minnesota was admitted 9 years later in 1858. So to become the 31st state, California had to agree to send 1 pro-slavery senator and 1 anti-slavery senator to Congress so the balance of power was preserved. Fremont won 29 out of 41 votes as the anti-slavery candidate, while the pro-slavery seat was won by the Democrat William Gwynn with 24 out of 41 votes, and they drew straws to see which one of them would get the shorter staggered term, and Fremont drew the short straw. Fremont served as the senator from California from the 10th of September in 1850 to the 3rd of March in 1851, and in that time he tried to pass a bill forbidding foreigners from buying land in California, but the bill failed, and Fremont would be unable to garner enough votes for re-election in March when his term was up, and his seat would remain empty for an entire year because the pro- and anti-slavery politics in California was so brutal that no anti-slavery candidate could get a majority. When Minnesota in 1858 and Oregon in 1859 both came in free, the Democrats tried to annex Cuba and Nicaragua to bring in as slave states, but that idea was defeated, and Kansas became the battleground state where Americans had bled for 7 years until Kansas came in free in 1861, and that vote in bleeding Kansas was the beginning of the war between the states. Kansas, lying in almost the exact geographical center of the United States, was to decide whether or not the state should enter the Union as free or slave. It was with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska bill that the real trouble in the territory began. In the state, the two contending forces fought bitterly for control. The Missourians early sought to bulldoze the Free State men to force them out of the territory. The Free State men refused to leave, and the Missourians resorted to arms. The border ruffians were a rough lot, usually in the pay of the plantation owners of Missouri and some other southern states. The slave owners furnished the border ruffians with supplies, among which was an abundance of liquor. In return they were to vote for slavery and intimidate the Free State settlers. This they never failed to do. The border ruffians came into the territory without their women, without implements for cultivation, but with plenty of whiskey and guns and ammunition. The Free State men came with their families and with plows to till the soil. They built good cabins and planted crops. The crops were destroyed and the cabins burned by the border ruffians, and the men were usually murdered in cold blood. With the entry of the state into the Union, the border troubles ceased for a time, but Kansas was not to have peace for long. The state was soon bearing her share of the burden of the Civil War. Collections of the Kansas State Historical Society, Volume XVIII, edited by William L.Z. Connolly. Topeka, Kansas State Printing Plant, B.P. Walker State Printer, 1928, page 144 and 6. During Fremont's trial, the gravity of the political divide between the North and the South had been brought home to both Benton and Fremont. And to encourage Fremont in the wake of the courts-martial, and because Congress was refusing to pay for another anti-slavery Fremont expedition, Benton proposed that he explore a new route for the railroad from St. Louis to the Pacific, and the idea was to find a path that trains could travel along the 38th parallel, the demarcation line between the North and the South, and that route would give neither side a claim to the railroad going to California, and in sharing the railroad, the country would stay united. Benton's friend John Adams Dix was the senator from New York, and he would become the president of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1863, and Senator Dix was married to the daughter of a rich, important Democrat, and Dix ran as a barn-burner Democrat in November of 1848, rather than stand for re-election as a pro-slavery Democrat. And the barn-burners were the few anti-slavery Democrats who thought it better to burn down one's own barn in order to get rid of the rats. Senator Dix lost that 1848 election and went to work for the railroads, which was Senator Benton's pet project, and this time Fremont's expedition would be privately financed by railroad men. Fremont dedicated himself to this new task of mapping a railroad route along the 38th parallel in hopes of keeping the North and the South together. And the plan was for Jesse to travel overland across the Isthmus of Panama to meet Fremont in California, where they would live together on their ranch. A railroad route had been proposed through Colorado more to the north, mapped by Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long, and they had gone through Gunnison after going over Monarch Pass, but it would be incredibly difficult to build a railroad through the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, so finding a way through the San Juan Mountains 50 miles farther south had seemed the better alternative. A railroad through Taos and Santa Fe farther south was squarely within the realm of the slave-holding South, so planning began for Fremont's fourth expedition in the fall of 1848 to find that railroad route through to California along the 38th parallel. Colorado was just west of Kansas, where the Great Plains ran into the Rocky Mountains, while going south turned into a high desert that stretched up from Mexico and tapered all the way into Oregon and southern Idaho, and Roswell, New Mexico was the geographical center of the high desert. The Spanish had been mining silver in New Mexico for centuries, and the Mexican government had sometimes exercised a harsh claim to that territory, so with the new boundary between America and Mexico settled after the war with Mexico, the railroad men were freed from any more trouble from the Mexican army. Not only did Fremont have a great deal of experience in finding trails, but he signed up his best men for this fourth expedition through the San Juan Mountains, and Fremont was good at not merely being able to suffer privation himself, but he was able to recruit people who were equally perseverant. Fremont hired a German mapmaker for this fourth expedition, and while the German mapmaker had been sick for 2 months, he took his German doctor with him. Fremont added 30 more men and over 100 pack mules to go up the headwaters of the Rio Grande to its source, and then over the mountains to the drainage of the Colorado River. And the more literate who signed on thought that keeping journals could make them prosperous with subsequent book sales, and so more than a few of the men would keep diaries along the trail of the fourth expedition. Fremont recruited a mountain man named Old Bill Williams, who'd been with Fremont's third expedition as far as Utah, and the old trapper knew where there was a pass through the San Juans that any railway train could manage in winter. And Fremont trusted him because Old Bill Williams had been living with the Indians in Colorado, the Osages and the Utes, and Old Bill Williams had been married to an Osage woman, and he'd been traversing the territory for over 24 years. The trip started out with a prairie fire in Kansas, and as they got to Bent's Fort near Pueblo it was already snowing more than usual, and by the time they got near the Continental Divide in the San Juans it was snowing 3 feet a day. The expeditioners bogged down and all the mules died, along with a third of the men, and Fremont sent some of them back to enlist a rescue party, while those left behind ate all the mules, and then they ate their own shoes, and then they ate some of the men. Historians without exception claim that Fremont went up Embargo Creek to go over Cochetopa Pass, but that would have put him back up on the Gunnison River up north the hard way, rather than going to the Gunnison along the Arkansas River and then up over the much easier Monarch Pass, a calm, gradual, and inviting incline due west of where the Arkansas turned sharply north on its way towards Vail. The third expedition had also its underlying political intention. Its chief geographical feature was very interesting. It was to explore and open what had hitherto been believed to be an uninhabitable desert, thence to find nearer passage through to the Pacific. Our journey was continuously in Mexican territory, from the head of the Arkansas River and through all of the Salt Lake Valley. The Century Illustrated Magazine, Volume 41, April 1891, The Conquest of California by John C. Fremont, page 920. Monarch Pass was easily seen from the Arkansas River, and Fremont had already been there on his second and third expeditions, and Pike and Long had been that same way up the Arkansas when Pike was arrested by Spanish soldiers, and Fremont knew it was quite possible to put a railroad over Monarch Pass to the Gunnison River, but that area had already been mapped, while Benton was interested in a railroad farther south through the unmapped headwaters of the Rio Grande River that would go along the 38th parallel. Fremont had taken the Santa Fe Trail through Spanish territory on his return trip from his second expedition, and had come up the Rio Grande from Taos and over Poncha Pass to Salida, and had then taken the Arkansas downstream to get back east, and the only route left unexplored was up the headwaters of the Rio Grande, where Old Bill Williams had drawn a rough map for Fremont showing the location of Stony Pass. Monarch Pass would have been a perfect route for a railroad had it been just a little farther south, a little more south, and Monarch Pass topped out at only 11,400 feet and was completely timbered, and when Fremont got back from his fourth expedition up the Rio Grande River, he said that he had been on naked ridges and that they had been at 12,000 feet, and it should be noted that Cochetopa Pass tops out at 10,000 feet and was also completely timbered. All the diary writers on the expedition described in their diaries that they'd been struggling over bare rocky slopes above timberline for many miles, and every diary said they had bogged down over the top of a mountain that was completely bare of trees, and they all said their mules had been falling down the steep sides of a mountain which would not have happened had there been trees to break their fall. Fremont's letter to Jessie from Taos on the 27th of January in 1849 described these naked ridges, and the diaries said that after crossing the top of the mountain they had sheltered in trees well below them, and Senator Benton described that they had been above timberline on a summit that was bare and made up only of rocks, and he wrote this description in his book 30 Years' View. Embargo Creek and Cochetopa Pass were nowhere near the headwaters of the Rio Grande, and Benton wrote that after getting over the bare summit there were trees on the other side 3 miles away down below the top of the mountain, affording shelter from the storm. But Cochetopa Pass was completely covered with trees, and Senator Benton had gotten his information first-hand from Fremont. When Forest Service rangers found some leather luggage up Embargo Creek in 1930, they started a story that the remnants of the baggage could have been Fremont's, and they put it into a museum at Del Norte, Colorado, and the luggage had been found in a clearing with trees cut down at the height of 12 feet. The clearing was an easy 2-hour hike above the vast Rio Grande River Valley, and nowhere near its headwaters, and the museum at Del Norte hosted a day-trip hike up to Fremont's alleged Christmas camp, a delightful experience, even though it's probably not at all the actual place, and that site cannot be positively linked to Fremont, while the found luggage could be just about anybody's in History Anonymous. Had they been up Embargo Creek, they would have been able to return back to the main river, Rio Grande River, easily, as described in Benjamin Kern's diary, whose brother Richard also wrote a day-to-day description. So where were they? Fremont had written from Bent's Fort to Senator Benton on the 17th of November in 1848. We will ascend the Del Norte to its head, descend onto the Colorado, and so across the Wasatch Mountains and the Basin country, somewhere near the 37th parallel, reaching the settled parts of California near Monterey. There is, I think, a pass in the Sierra Nevada between the 37th and 38th, which I wish to examine. The party is in good spirits and good health. We have a small store of provisions for hard times, and our instruments, barometer included, all in good order. Fremont's Fourth Expedition, a documentary account of the disaster of 1848 to 1849, with diaries, letters, and reports by participants in the tragedy, edited with an introduction and notes by Leroy R. Hafen, Professor of History, Brigham Young University, State Historian of Colorado, Emeritus, and Ann W. Hafen, Glendale, California, The Arthur H. Clarke Company, 1960, page 302. Having proven his unbroken loyalty to the manifest destiny of America, it is a real possibility that Fremont had been entrusted with 60 pounds of gold bars worth $20,000 from the U.S. Treasury to take west for safekeeping should the war between the North and the South break out. And the story of Fremont's lost gold being somewhere up in them thar hills was generally disbelieved due to the plethora of similar tales about lost gold. Perhaps historians engaged in a conspiracy to keep people from looking for Fremont's lost gold, since a few had already died looking for it, or better, perhaps they hoped to solve the mystery themselves, and the Cochetopa version pointed people towards a much milder area that was less dangerous to amateur gold hunters. Leaving his stranded Fourth Expedition in order to procure relief, Fremont had followed the Rio Grande River going downstream until he got to Taos, and some from the party suspected he had taken the gold with him and that it had been intended as payroll for when they arrived in California. Nobody would have even known about the gold, except that the mules kept dying, and the baggage had to be packed and repacked, and Fremont would return to the area during his 5th expedition in 1853, and whether or not he found the lost gold remained a mystery, because old Bill Williams and Benjamin Kern had gone back right away, 2 months after the tragedy in March of 1849, and they'd taken a couple of Mexicans with them to bring back the lost baggage. The lost baggage. Their intention had been to also retrieve the belongings that had been hidden in the cave, and while they were sorting through the luggage, Ute Indians killed old Bill Williams and Benjamin Kern, but the Indians let the Mexicans go free. The Mexicans said that the Indians took the baggage away, and a number of years later, some papers and diaries that had been stolen by the Indians were found and put into the Henry E. Huntington Library. The original of Richard Kern's diary was 4 3/4 by 7 1/4 inches, and for this History Anonymous rendition, the word canon is made into canyon with a Y in historical license, so operatic thinking may be made possible. Also, there were 2 versions of Richard Kern's diary, one in the original cryptic style, and the other published before the presidential election of 1856, where Fremont was the newly formed Republican Party's candidate, and the electioneering version of Richard's diary contained a few additions that made Fremont look guilty, with different compass course corrections added to make it appear they had gone up Embargo Creek, or maybe even Alder Creek, just west of Embargo Creek. Richard's rewritten diary was sworn to 3 years after his death, and signed with his signature attesting to its truthfulness. And because dead men tell no tales, the best clue to Fremont's lost gold was a sketch drawn by Richard of a specific rock formation on the last page of his diary. Most versions of the story said that old Bill Williams and Richard Kern's brother Benjamin had already recovered the baggage when the Indians came upon them, and the Indians aren't telling. And when old Bill Williams and his companion died at the hands of the Utes, old Bill was 62 years old, and it is possible that he had already moved the gold before it fell into the hands of the Indians, fueling the reality of how unbelievable history can be when written into books, especially a story based on anonymous word of mouth. The Rio Grande River was only 15 miles downhill from the top of Embargo Creek, and the Rio Grande there ran 150 feet wide in the middle of open terrain, and Embargo Creek at its base was never more than ankle deep where it joins the Rio Grande River, while the diaries described the men falling through the ice up to their waists in the river as they struggled toward the bare summits above timberline. The headwaters of the Rio Grande were another 50 miles due west, far away, where the Rio Grande did indeed remain deep enough for men and mules to fall into. Embargo Creek comes from due north of the Rio Grande at a 90-degree angle, so they could not have been on the western side of the summit after crossing over the top, according to Fremont's description. But if they'd gone up Embargo Creek, they would have been on the northern side of the mountains, and Fremont certainly knew how to use a compass, so where were they? All historical accounts claim they had headed up Embargo Creek or Alder Creek and become lost, but how authentic could that story be? How did the expeditioners know where they were? To find latitude, one used a sextant to shoot the sun at noon, or at night Polaris, the North Star, to measure its height in degrees above the horizon, then consulted an astronomical table. The Dutch book on astronomy that Fremont had stumbled upon in Charleston had sparked his passion for observing the night sky, and his naval tour and 2 Appalachian surveys had provided a solid foundation in geodesy, and it had nurtured in Fremont a discipline that approached that of a religious ritual. Fremont marveled at the exacting task of using compass, pen, and paper to render each day's, quote, bird's eye view, close quote, of the terrain covered. Pathfinder, John Charles Fremont, page 50 to 51. Benjamin Kern wrote in his diary that they'd been looking down on the drainage of the Colorado River on the 14th of December, Fremont's Fourth, page 103, not on the Gunnison, and another Fremont history book said, he planned to lead the rest of the party southwest to the headwaters of the Rio Grande, where they could rest and wait for the rescue party to return, but the 15-mile journey took the weakened main body of the expedition 20 days to complete. John Charles Fremont and the Great Western Reconnaissance by Edward D. Harris, New York, Chelsea House Publishers, 1990, page 91. The beginning of the Gunnison watershed was at Monarch Pass, that was at 38.5 degrees within Northern Territory, and 0 degrees latitude was at the equator, so Benton was looking for a railroad route south of Monarch Pass. The headwaters of the Gunnison River was 60 miles north of the Rio Grande, and there was no way anyone would go up into the hills to the north of the Rio Grande around Embargo Creek, but would have followed the natural wide canyon carved by the mighty Rio Grande River coming out of the west from its headwaters. If railroad builders wanted to go through the Gunnison watershed, they would have entered the mountains along the Arkansas River, because Cochetopa Pass was simply too far out of the way and was going in the wrong direction. Because progress was measured by the stars, Fremont's recorded mileage was as the bird flies, and the two Kern brothers, making entries into their diaries, would ask Fremont how many miles they'd gone each day, and he would usually tell them. On the 7th of December, they'd gotten over Mosca Pass through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and left the great sand dunes behind, and they went 22 miles into the middle of the San Luis Valley that Thursday, and they camped for the night. On Friday, the 8th of December, they made it across the San Luis Valley and camped on the Rio Grande River that night. And the night before, they had seen timber 7 miles away to the southwest, and they'd been traveling west or northwest. Benjamin wrote, quote, "At last turned to southwest and reached the timber on the Del Norte bottom," close quote, on Friday night, and the turning to the southwest would have gotten them to Girard 2 miles before South Fork, because the trail along the Rio Grande headed southwest for 4 miles before reaching Girard. From the bottom of Mosca Pass to a water hole 10 miles to the west where they could have camped for the night, then 22 miles due west into the San Luis Valley the next day, would have put them 7 miles above and a couple miles to the east of Monte Vista, where they would have seen the timbered Rio Grande River 7 miles to the southwest, and Fremont had been headed for the exact parallel of 37.7 through which he could see the Rio Grande emerging from the Rocky Mountains, and Monte Vista in Spanish meant mountain view. After the night spent without water in the middle of the San Luis Valley, as described in the diaries, where they had to melt snow for water, they traveled due west until they, quote, struck the river, and camped on Friday night somewhere near Girard on the northern bank of the Rio Grande, then, quote, moved in the valley of the river, close quote, the next day, according to Richard. The first rocks to rise out of the ground after the endless eastern plains are at Girard, and that change in scenery is striking after the flat monotony of the prairie, and it is at Girard that they would finally be able to record that they had, quote, struck the canyon of the river, close quote. They wouldn't have stopped on Friday until getting to Girard, because it's completely flat and featureless until then, and Richard said that on Saturday they, quote, moved in valley of the river on the east bank, quote, close quote, while Benjamin said they, quote, passed along the river in a southwest and southerly direction, close quote, and the Rio Grande did indeed head southwest for the last 7 miles, going through Girard toward South Fork 2 miles later, after coming due west from the San Luis Valley for 11 miles. Benjamin wrote that on Saturday they had, quote, come to a canyon of perpendicular rocks, which turned us back so that we had to cross over the hill, close quote. And Richard said there were, quote, immense stones and rocks, close quote. And Benjamin said these, quote, huge hills of granite with perpendicular strata appear on each side of the river as we crossed the river and camped in plenty of snow, distance 15 miles, close quote. So the camp on Saturday night would have been exactly 15 miles by the stars from their camp at Girard the previous night. Wagon Wheel Gap fit the description of a canyon of perpendicular rocks where the expedition was turned back because their path had been blocked by its 200-foot-tall cliffs on both sides, squeezing the river into a death trap, and Fremont would have shot the sun at the base of the cliff at Wagon Wheel Gap because prominent geological features were the mainstay of map-making. South Fork was 2 miles southwest of Girard, and Alder Creek came down out of the mountains from the north right at South Fork, while Embargo Creek was 7 miles further back downstream towards the east. And these small streams were coming down from the group of mountains separating the Rio Grande River watershed that fed into the Gulf of Mexico from the Gunnison River basin to the north, feeding into the Gulf of California. When the story was told after the expedition had met with disaster, it became a tale about going up a small stream to the north after a fork in the river. And in the story, the direction of the river when disaster struck had been due north, and when the expedition was stopped at Wagon Wheel Gap, they were on the north side of the river, directly across from the Goose River Valley to the south, where they could clearly see some lower hills offering a way around the obstacle of the perpendicular cliffs at Wagon Wheel Gap, and so they crossed to the south side of the Rio Grande and made camp that night on Goose Creek. From Girard to Wagon Wheel Gap was 12 miles as the bird flies, and the first geographical feature they'd seen after crossing the San Luis Valley that resembled anything like entering a canyon was at Girard, and that was 25 miles away from their last camp, where there were lovely large cottonwood trees flanking the river and plenty of space to camp. The terrain around the river had suddenly grown hills at Girard, 2 miles before the South Fork, and neither diarist recorded how many miles they traveled on Friday, other than Benjamin saying that they, quote, at last turned to southwest and reached the timber on the Del Norte bottom, close quote, which meant that they were on the north side of the Rio Grande. So when they crossed the river the next day on Saturday, they would have been on the south side by Goose Creek and unable to go up Embargo Creek that was on the north side of the Rio Grande. Richard said that the next day on Sunday they, quote, moved about 3 miles further up and, quote, had fine camp for that Sunday. And Benjamin wrote, quote, proceeded 6 miles and camp in very good timber on the river, which we recrossed at evening. Godey brought in an elk. Benjamin wrote, quote, proceeded 6 miles and camp in very good timber on the river, which we recrossed at evening. Godey brought in an elk, close quote. So where were they? Did Godey bring in an elk at evening, or did they recross the river at evening, and what river did they recross? When they stopped at Wagon Wheel Gap, getting across the Rio Grande had been a major endeavor because it ran deep and strong, over 150 feet wide. So would they have recrossed the Rio Grande again? Or was Benjamin saying they had crossed Goose Creek over to its western side, having crossed the Rio Grande downstream of Goose Creek, where it was wider and less deep? Sunday was warm and clear, so Fremont would have been able to shoot the sun and let Benjamin know that Sunday night that they had come exactly 6 miles up Goose Creek from the base of the cliff at Wagon Wheel Gap, and exactly 6 miles upriver there were 2 small lakes and a prominent cliff formation that would have made a good mark on a map. Above Two Lakes Camp, Goose Creek was 25 feet wide coming down out of the hills on the southern side of the Rio Grande, and Goose Creek would become 30 feet wide before emptying into the Rio Grande at Wagon Wheel Gap. There were no trees to tie ropes for the crossing except downstream of Goose Creek to the east, so after crossing the Rio Grande, they would have been on the eastern bank of Goose Creek and would need to cross to its western side to continue their journey. That was noted as a recrossing in Benjamin's diary, while Richard didn't mention it because Goose Creek would have been a small stream compared to the mighty Rio Grande, which was America's second longest river. And at Wagon Wheel Gap, the Rio Grande was 150 feet across and deadly in the fast water, and was at least 3 feet deep in the best shallow stretch. 3 miles up Goose Creek, there was a prominent hill where Leopard Creek forked off to the east, and that would have been a good place to rest and dry out on Saturday night. Then on Sunday they camped for the night at Two Lakes Camp, exactly 3 miles farther upstream, where they hunted some elk and had a nice Sunday feast. Across from Two Lakes Camp was another large formation of cliffs helpful to map makers, and both diary writers recorded that they'd been allowed to sleep until noon on Sunday. Richard did not say how far they went on Saturday, except for moving up 3 miles on Sunday, and he didn't mention recrossing a river, but he wrote that on Monday they would go 12 miles and camp on what he would only call the river from then on. And in his rewritten diary after his death, the direction of travel would become course west by north, while Benjamin said they went west by southwest, and made 10 miles and camped on a creek in 4 feet of snow. So where were they? The camp at Leopard Creek was exactly 14 miles from the camp at Girard, and Richard and Benjamin's diaries differ by 2 miles for that weekend, and the key to the mystery was that they'd crossed the river on Saturday when they couldn't get past Wagon Wheel Gap, with its 2 solid walls of rock rising straight up on either side of the river with no bank to walk on, and they had to, quote, go over the hills, close quote, after crossing the river, and they went 3 miles farther up a river on Sunday, then spent the rest of the day at their leisure, which meant they would have been at Two Lakes Camp. The headwaters of the Rio Grande were a long way away, and Embargo Creek was so small it would have been hard to see beneath the snow, as would Alder Creek, but Goose Creek was over 10 times that size. And when the adventurers returned from their near-death experience, they would tell a story about a small stream that went northwards, after a fork in the river, and while there were no maps, many mountain people knew about South Fork on the Rio Grande just past Girard, and people also knew that the directions from old Bill Williams had been to go north at the last fork in the headwaters, where one branch went west and another went north. The written records of the expedition were left in a cave for safekeeping when the snow forced them to backtrack out of the mountains. So when the Forest Service found the abandoned luggage up Embargo Creek with the tree trunks cut off over 10 feet tall, that became Fremont's Christmas camp, and Alder Creek was pegged as their return journey, and so History Anonymous goes. On Saturday, they'd camped after going southwest and southerly for 3 miles after crossing the river. And Richard said that on Sunday they, quote, moved 3 miles further up the river and camped in a very fine grove of cottonwood, close quote, and Two Lakes Camp was 6 miles south of the Rio Grande, and the following day going over the hills would have put them back on the Rio Grande, 12 miles away by the stars from Sunday's camp. They would now be at the base of Hogback Mountain, but Fremont would probably have traveled to the timber at the western edge of the plain where the Rio Grande River sharply turned northward, and there in his Monday night camp, along the cliffs that made a good reference marker, Fremont spent the evening on Monday night updating his maps. Both diarists said that they had been, quote, forced to turn back and pass over the top of the hill, or that they were, quote, going over the hills, and that would have meant going southward up Goose Creek and over where Spar City would later arise. And from Girard to Wagon Wheel Gap was 17 miles on foot, or 15 miles as the crow flies, and from Wagon Wheel Gap back downstream to Goose Creek was less than a mile. The hills to the south were gentle and rolling, while the north side of the Rio Grande River boasted huge perpendicular rock formations for many miles, so they would have headed south up Goose Creek and followed the smoother valleys towards the west until they came out on the Rio Grande on the other side of the hills, 12 miles later as the bird flies. How did they know they would pick up the river on the other side? Because Fremont was the most skilled mapmaker in America, and he was keeping careful track of where they were according to the sun and the stars, and while Creed was at 37.9 degrees parallel, they never went that far north. And Two Lakes Camp was 15 miles due west from Girard, and Benjamin said they had gone 15 miles. The two lakes would be named Hay Press Lake and Lake Humphreys, and they were precisely 6 miles up Goose Creek from the Rio Grande River, and Hay Press Lake was 200 feet by 100 feet, and Lake Humphreys was 1,500 feet by 500 feet, and that would have been a very nice place to spend the rest of the day on Sunday eating elk cooked over an open fire. The hills are lower on the southern side of the Rio Grande, less than 1/3 the size of the more impassable ranges on the northern side that separated the expedition from the Gunnison watershed they had no intention of going towards. And their going over the hills to the south was a straight shot to the west from 6 miles up Goose Creek, and crossing over the hills would dump them out directly below Hogback Mountain, back on the Rio Grande just a few miles from the entrance to a horrid box canyon they would struggle through on Tuesday the 12th. Sunday had been a long camp, and that meant it was a day of rest, and Godey took 5 men out to get some elk and bagged 2. And the next day on Monday they went over the hills to Hogback Mountain, and Richard would record that they went 12 miles. The Rio Grande River makes an oxbow arch from South Fork to Hogback Mountain, with the bend to the north and the legs to the south, and the oxbow is 20 miles long as the river flows, and across its base is a 12-mile journey over the hills, and Creed is at the top of the oxbow, right past Wagon Wheel Gap. Benjamin said that on Monday they went 10 miles, while Richard said about 12 miles, and after going over the hills from the Two Lakes Camp to rejoin the Rio Grande at its southernmost tip, was exactly 10 miles by the stars. They were traveling on Monday west and southwest, according to Benjamin, and it was a clear day with, quote, hills very steep and rugged, trail winding among small pinyons, affording shelter from the wind, mountains very steep and rough, fine valley, camped among cottonwoods, made about 12 miles, close quote. The pinyon were pine trees that were now the primary vegetation, along with quaking aspen trees, because the expedition was now on higher ground where cottonwoods would no longer grow. Richard did not give a direction for Monday's progress in his original diary, but said they, quote, struck creek, and it was a cold and hilly ride, and the day was dry clear, with hills very steep and rugged. And when they reached a fine valley, there were again some cottonwoods along the river where they camped. So where did they camp on Monday night? There certainly were no cottonwoods up Embargo Creek, and there were no cottonwoods above Wagon Wheel Gap, although there were a few groves of aspen trees on the other side, at the bottom of the ravine through Spar City, and Richard may have identified them as cottonwoods after 10 miles of moving through pines. In Richard's revised diary written after his death, the line, quote, camped among cottonwoods that Monday night was removed, perhaps because it would have been a physical impossibility and his credibility was at stake, or because these were the first grove of aspen trees Richard had seen, and mistaking them for cottonwoods would not have befitted a scholar of his class, although the aspen trees would have had no leaves at the time, so they could have been mistaken for cottonwoods. The cottonwood tree would be named Populus Fremonti, and would be called the Fremont cottonwood or the Alamo cottonwood, and the tree could grow below elevations of 6,600 feet, while a narrow-leaf cottonwood could grow up to the altitude of 8,000 feet before being replaced by alpine evergreen conifers and quaking aspen. Creed was at an elevation of 8,800 feet, and at the base of Hogback Mountain they were now higher than that. Cottonwoods had been growing all along the Rio Grande River until the expedition had reached the high country. After going over the hills on Monday, where they would have been introduced to Populus tremuloidus, or aspen trees, that were now growing thickly in groves, rather than the few surviving at lower altitudes. And aspen do not like to grow below 5,000 feet, and are readily choked out by cottonwoods. Only Richard mentioned camping among cottonwoods on both Saturday and Monday night, and after Tuesday the diarists would call them aspens. Before Girard, there had been nothing but flat land for many miles on either side of the river, and cottonwoods had grown thickly around its banks, and precisely at Girard were the first hills with rock outcroppings that would have caused them to believe they had indeed entered a canyon of the mountains for the first time. Since coming over Mosca Pass through the standalone Sangre de Cristo mountain range, right at Girard was the first hint that the expedition was finally entering the Rocky Mountains, and just past Girard at South Fork, the Rio Grande turned sharply northwards towards Creed 15 miles away, and there, just a couple miles from that sharp turn north, were the perpendicular rocks and cliffs that were only a foretaste of what was to come at Wagon Wheel Gap. The weather had been clear, and Fremont could have shot the stars at their Saturday night camp 3 miles up Goose Creek, where there is a prominent rock formation that would have made a good marker on a map. So he would have been able to tell Richard that they had, quote, moved up 3 miles from Wagon Wheel Gap. And that would have been precisely 3 miles from where he shot the sun in front of Wagon Wheel Gap. Then on Sunday night, Fremont would have told the Kern brothers that they had come precisely 3 miles farther up Goose Creek to the Two Lakes camp, and Benjamin had recorded that they'd gone 6 miles. By the stars on Saturday, they were exactly 15 miles away from Girard, just as Benjamin had written in his Saturday entry, and Sunday they had slept until noon and feasted on a couple of elk, and the next day on Monday they would go over the hills to take up the Rio Grande again to the west, and at the bottom of Hogback Mountain, the Rio Grande River was still running over 100 feet wide and nowhere near its headwaters. On the following day they would resume their journey towards the west, with their first difficult days during Tuesday and Wednesday in the upcoming Box Canyon, and that would bring them much closer to the Continental Divide. So where were they? Precisely 12 miles away by the stars, due west of Two Lakes Camp on the southern bank of the Rio Grande, was a small lake nestled below the hills making up the base of the mountains from where the Rio Grande emerged, and this little lake was a circle 700 feet in diameter, and the little lake was less than 1,000 feet away from the Rio Grande, and just south of the entrance to the Box Canyon. Benjamin said that they had only gone 10 miles on Monday after crossing the hills, while Richard said it had been 12, and Benjamin said it had been, quote, a hard day, encamped at 3 o'clock on a creek in 4 feet snow, at 3 o'clock disc 10 miles, found plenty of bark to make a bed, with a good fire, day clear, close quote, and Benjamin said that he had traveled west and southwest, while Richard did not say what direction he'd gone, just that it had been 12 miles. Were they sharing information with each other after getting mileage reports from Fremont and then making their own calculations? Were they stopping at different camps? 8 miles as the crow flies from Two Lakes Camp, just at the bottom of the long canyon they would have traveled through to get over the hills where Spar City would later be, there was a small stream 5 feet wide called Lime Creek that ended in a grove of aspen and scrub oak 1 mile away from the Rio Grande, and Fremont may have left the Kern brothers there with whoever else wanted to make camp early at 3 in the afternoon, and then Fremont could have gone on with some others to the little lake camp 4 miles farther along the river bottom in the wide flat valley, and they would have been able to see the smoke from each other's fires through field glasses. Now at an altitude of 9,000 feet, Fremont could have allowed the Kern brothers to lag behind at the bottom of Lime Creek so they could catch up on some rest while Fremont caught up on his map making at the little lake, and that would explain Benjamin's record of the exact 10-mile measurement from Two Lakes Camp for his entry of Monday's progress. Fremont would not have left them there without shooting the sun and checking his barometer apparatus, and the historical confusion had begun from that Sunday description in their diaries, as all history books would claim that it was at that point that the company headed up Embargo Creek, even though it could not have happened if they had crossed the mighty Rio Grande and were now on its southern side. When Richard wrote that they, quote, went up the river, it could only have meant Goose Creek coming down from the hills on the south, and with that much cleared up, we are so much closer to finding Fremont's lost gold.